Well, good afternoon. This is State Senator Gerald Neal, and here we are again on Straight Talk. So it's my pleasure to bring you this discussion this morning. Normally we have a guest, a very special guest. We've had guests ranging from the mayor of the city of Louisville, Congressman John Yormuth, you name it. In fact, next week we're going to have U.S. Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, but that's next week. This week, what I want to do is focus in on issues that, in terms of policy changes or potential policy changes that might take place here in Louisville. In fact, in the state of Kentucky. Some of them have already taken place in Louisville, in fact. But there's a larger issue here as well, because there's more than Louisville. You go to the county line and you're still in Kentucky, but you're not in Louisville. So police are still doing their job outside. And the question is, what kind of job are they doing? So before we get to that, let's give a nod to Juneteenth. Yesterday, I was involved in a number of celebrations that, quite frankly, were very inspiring and so forth. But I have to say that part of that discussion actually underscored the fact that we still have not arrived. That even though they got the late news in terms of the Civil War being over in June of 1865, the reality is that we, in fact, are still not there. We have gone through black codes, we've gone through separate but equal, we've gone through Jim Crow, we've gone through everything else, and now we're facing not only overt racism, but systemic and structural racism. So these things are realities that we can't deny. So today we're going to deal with a little of that and put Juneteenth into perspective. We have to understand that it's good to have the celebration, but the reality is what follows. What in concrete terms changes the trajectory in terms of what racism has wrought upon this nation, and in particular, African Americans. So I'm glad that you're here with me this morning. I hope more join us. I'm going to ask you to share this as far as you can. Later on, we're going to post this up on YouTube, probably Monday at least. But we're going to talk about policy options that relate to police accountability, health and criminal justice disparities, and more. So we're just going to get a little commentary here and get comfortable and see where we can go with this. Now, before we get to that, remember June 23rd is what? Primary day. So those with absentee ballots, you better drop them today, I would suggest, or you can take them in. You can take those ballots in. You can go and vote at the poll. It's at the fairgrounds over on Phillips Lane. That entrance over there probably would be the best way to get in. But plan to vote. They say there are 800 plus thousand absentee ballots have gone out, and a great number of them have gone out in Jefferson County, but also in Lexington. But 850 or 60, I forget the number, is a good number. And the question is does that change the trajectory in voting? And I think that's important because, as you know, there have been voter suppression activity that's gone on historically as relates to Black people. But the question now is, should we be narrowing the opportunity to vote, or should we be broadening that opportunity? Well, we're going to find out what happens with these absentee ballots. If these absentee ballots expand voting participation, isn't that what democracy is about? You eligible to vote and you cast a vote, and you cast a vote on the person of your choice. Well, in the primary, you choose who you want for your party. Kentucky has what they call a closed primary system. So you're choosing what you think is important in terms of your party, the person you want to represent you, or best reflects what you think and believe. Then in the general election, which comes up November 3rd, then it's a two-party piece for the most part, the Republican and the Democratic Party. So in this instance, I'm a Democrat in the 33rd district, And so the primary, I'm registered as a Democrat, obviously, and all of those that are registered as Democrats should be voting in this primary. Well, we're going to see what happens in terms of their voting at this particular time. It's going to be important to see what happens with respect to that. Because if it shows an expansion of voting, then should we not be, and I dare say we should be, employing absentee ballot voting, not because there's some emergency or you just can't be in the jurisdiction, but because you decide this is how you're going to vote. I'm going to vote by mail this year. So you can request your ballot, or they can devise whatever system, maybe something similar to what they have now, to do that. So we should find out what the flaws are in the system this time, assuming there will be. I know if no system doesn't have some issue, and we can correct those in time for the general election. So stay tuned on this particular piece. Voting is important. I'm encouraging everyone to take part in this voting this time. It's easier this time because of absentee ballots, those who have taken advantage of it. But if you're old fashioned, you want to get down there to the poll, we have a polling place that you can do that at the fairgrounds. Another development in the Breonna Taylor case. Mayor Fisher announced that he was initiating termination proceedings or procedures against Officer Brett Hankerson. He's the one that sprayed indiscriminately gunfire into the apartment of Breonna Taylor, which ended tragically in her death. But I think the angle here is that not just that he was at the apartment that he shot his gun, but he did it indiscriminately and contrary to the policy of the police, what they're trained to do and what they're required to do. In other words, you don't spray bullets indiscriminately because you know that there's always a possibility of someone else getting hurt. And of course, in this case, we know that bullets went into adjoining apartments. Bullets went inanely in different directions, etc. And of course, bullets killed Breonna Taylor. So I believe this is one of the bases that they're using, but also this same officer is under investigation because he's been accused of sexual misconduct by several women. So we're going to see what happens in that particular investigation. But the mayor did take action in this regard. We'll see how this goes. But there's a very interesting thing happened because the mayor couldn't talk about it any further. And guess why? Because we have a law in Kentucky that muffles the mayor from talking. A law. If he discusses this case or his actions outside of what he did, then he very well may be in violation of that law. Why is there such a law? I mean, there's no law that says that anyone else that does something that it cannot be explained by an employer. I mean, some people forget, and sometimes our police forget, the FOP, I should say, forget that we don't work for the police. We do not work for the police. The police work for us. And what the police do or do not do should reflect what the community expects of them and their employer, their immediate employer. And that's the city of Louisville in this instance. Why do we have this restriction here? Why are we putting extra protection on the FOP? If you commit a crime, you already have constitutional protections. You have those protections. They already know. They say to everybody all the time. They know better than anybody else. You have a right to remain silent, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They know that. They're trained to give that admonition, and it's not a matter of them being ignorant of that fact. So we know that beyond that, then the issue is, should that person be arrested? Should that person be indicted? Which raises another question. You know, the relationship between prosecutors and the police is very close because prosecutors, after all, depend on police to bring evidence to make their cases. Should a prosecutor, particularly in the case of police misconduct, should that office, the immediate office, be the one that's making judgments about whether or not they should be bringing charges in that particular regard? Or should it be an independent entity that does that? That's the thing that bothers me. And I think we ought to take a look at that. I think independent, and regardless of what happened in this case, don't get stuck on this case, because what we're talking about and what we are talking about is what we should do in certain circumstances, because all the circumstances have certain facts that have certain details that are different. So the question is, do we have a unbiased, um, a person free of any influence, making decisions and determinations in the public interest in a very independent way? Well, even if they are, we should eliminate the appearance that there's a conflict. I would suggest there is a conflict in that regard. You can pass around in anybody's office one of the prosecutors that you want, but it still comes from that same office. That's something we should look at. And that's not to cast aspersions on any particular prosecutor. I'm just talking about the nature of human behavior and what's happened historically, and why put a prosecutor's office in that position. It doesn't seem reasonable to me. They should invite this, I would think. So the mayor's office moving there. There are certain other things on the book in terms of state statute that needs to be examined because of what has happened over the last several months. But really, what has happened since I can remember, and for those that have been around can remember. So it's very important that we take a look at that. So those are two of the important things I think we should take a look at. But this afternoon, we want to delve a little deeper into what are the options. And I was doing a little research, and I looked at certain things that certain states, what certain states did. And I tell you, I was really fascinated and quite encouraged by what Colorado, they just passed a bill. I mean, we're right in the midst of it. Of course, now we're not in legislature in Kentucky, but in Colorado, they just passed a bill and they responded. And I want to go through some of this because I think it's germane to what we're dealing with here. And then I'm going to go through some of the other areas I think are important. And I think it's very important for us to take note now as to what we're doing. Colorado, I'm going to go one by one. Some of these things have taken place on the city of Louisville's level. But what I want you to think about is that we're not talking just about the city of Louisville. We're talking about the entire state of Kentucky. So what happens in Louisville does not affect what happens in the state of Kentucky. So the responsibility of myself and my colleagues in the House is all of Kentucky, which includes Louisville. So one thing they did in this bill, this is a state bill in Colorado. Denver, Colorado is where their capital is, and it's what they did. That they require every officer in the state, with some exceptions for jail deputies in facilities that already have cameras, undercover officers, and those in administrative positions will have to use body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras as of July 1st, 2023. So it gives them a little time to get that together. But the point is, they're requiring body-worn cameras, and the cameras that must be activated when officers are responding to calls of service. That's the general language. I would say whenever they confront a citizen in any fashion, police who purposely fail, and this is a key thing, and this is something we should always keep in mind. Police who fail to activate their cameras or tamper with them could face criminal liability or other penalties. There has to be penalties. That's key. And also it says the footage will be required to be released within 21 days after an allegation of misconduct, or within 45 days if released would jeopardize a criminal investigation. Now that's very important. If we did something here in Kentucky, the language may vary somewhat, but the gist of this is that it's good for the officer and it's good for the citizen to have an encounter with the police recorded. That way, the facts will speak for themselves. And the more we use them, I think the better. Here's another one, Colorado law. use of force. They banned the use of chokeholds. You know, chokeholds where they take their arm and put it around someone's neck and they put in pressure to both sides of the neck, which cuts off oxygen and induces um, people, lose consciousness and sometimes death. So that's a problem. So they're saying no. They're saying that you can't use this. It says the policy will require officers to only use force if necessary, and deadly force can't be used against someone for a minor or non-violent offense. Remember that case up in New York where the individual in New York was peddling something on the street and it ended up in what? His death because of a chokehold, and that guy got off. That's another story. That's another discussion, but we'll see about that. But my point is that chokeholds should be banned across the state, including Louisville. So we'll see about that. Oh, here's one I think is very important that's in this bill. Failure to intervene. An officer who fails to try to stop another from using excessive force could face a class 1 misdemeanor or greater charge. Officer will be protected from retaliation. In other words, even if they intervene for those purposes, they're not going to be retaliated against. At least they'll be protected by the law from retaliation. But it makes it a penalty if they do not intervene. Think about how many times we've heard the discussion that we've witnessed on tape where someone was using excessive force and an officer was standing to the side and did not take action of any kind to prevent this. Well, this is something that would encourage another type of behavior. Fired cops, officers who plead guilty to or are convicted of an inappropriate use of force, failure to intervene to stop excessive force, are found civilly liable for excessive force or failure to intervene, will lose their peace officer standards and training board certification permanently. Now, if that's not an incentive to behave, what else is? You will no longer be a police officer. And guess what? According to this law, it will create and maintain a public database of officers who have been decertified, fired, found to be untruthful, or repeatedly failed to follow training requirements. That's very important because then other entities across the state will know and understand who those officers are. You've heard about qualified immunity. This is the immunity that they give to police officers for civil liability, people suing them for the actions that they undertake. Well, in this bill in Colorado, the bill removes the qualified immunity defense. That defense is gone, allowing people to bring civil rights claims in Colorado courts. People who allege civil rights violations will be able to sue officers in their individual capacities. That's important. Officers determined not to have acted in good faith or with a reasonable belief that what they did was legal can be held personally liable. Now, they say here for 5% of a judgment or settlement of $25,000, whichever is less. I'm not sure that I can go along with that. I think that there are situations here where officers should subject themselves to a jury determination as to what that damage would be. This bill also has, in terms of police prosecutions, State Attorney General has the authority to prosecute persistently bad departments and officers. In other words, the Attorney General would be proactive in this regard, and it specifically outlines this in this particular bill. Protesters' protections. Have you ever heard of the First Amendment right? Well, this country was founded on protests, but lo and behold, we see that what happens quite often is that some people don't understand that because they have certain authorities as police officers, that they can use their force, their authority in any way they want to, arbitrarily. Well, in this bill, officers will be prohibited from shooting rubber bullets indiscriminately into a crowd. Prohibited, as well as targeting rubber bullet shots at someone's head, torso, or back. Head, torso, or back. I guess that leaves what? Legs? Here's the point. Rubber bullets are these pepper ball, whatever they use here in Louisville's police department. They can put somebody's eye out. They can hurt you. These things are not toys. And to indiscriminately use them causes bodily harm potentially and has in various cases. This is a protection. This is getting down to the detail in terms of how force is used. Data tracking. Law enforcement agencies will have to send the state data on their use of force resulting in serious injury or death, as well as stops, unannounced entries, and use of firearms. Some demographic information also will be required. So what we're talking about here is that the police officers would have to, the data would have to be collected in a way that it could be studied, it could be looked at. So I think that bill in Colorado has gone a long way. But let's look a little further. I'm going to go down a few issues that I think that need to be considered by our state. I think there should be a statewide standard with respect to police as it relates to requiring periodic de-escalation training. Think about what just happened. What just happened in Atlanta, Georgia? Just think about it. Here's an individual who was asleep, drunk, they say, but asleep. Carries on a 20-some-odd minute conversation, amiable conversation with the police. And no one was in immediate danger of any kind. So all of a sudden they decide, well, he's drunk, let's arrest him. Why? It's my understanding he lived around the corner, offered to walk home. He could have called a relative who would have come around and picked him up. They had custody of his car. He could not drive. And then he gets into a scuffle with him and he runs off. And albeit with one of these little taser things. And they know he's drunk. He's running. They know who he is. His car's right there. They know they can get him anytime down the road. And not only that, they could probably follow a safe distance behind and he would have given up at some point. What did they do? They took the opportunity to shoot and kill. And if you really looked at those videos, you begin to see how they regarded this individual who disregarded their instruction, who resisted their attempt to arrest him, who ran from them and fired a taser back that wasn't going to, and they know the nature of tasers, hurt anybody. And I heard a sheriff say something about, well, he could have gotten access to the gun. Get access to what gun? There were two of them with firearms. Two. He didn't have a firearm. Anybody will give any excuse, won't they, to defend what they think is defensible when we really know it's indefensible. With de-escalation training, their thinking processes would have been, how do we get out of this, or how do we get to our objective without causing injury or death to that individual, to ourselves, and to others? A whole different thought process. It's not, he's trying to escape. He's trying to escape with a misdemeanor. He's trying to escape even if it was technically a felony in that particular regard, rising out of that series of incidents. How could they think about shooting him in the back if they were trained and understood this is how you deal with this kind of situation? it would have been a completely different outcome. A father to a daughter would have had a father, a wife would have had a husband. This individual, as I've understood, was on the track of straightening out his life, etc. The officers would have gone about their business. One of them would have not been charged with a felony murder. The other would have not been charged with aggravated assault. All of that happened in that instance because of a lack of de-escalation training. A lack of it. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense to me. There should be use of force standards that set guidelines to restrict use of force where possible. In that instance, those guidelines would have said, this is not a situation where we use force, especially excessive force. We should also review state statutes governing police and eliminate unwarranted restrictions and protections that are not afforded other citizens. If you break the law, what gives you something extra because you're a police officer? If you break the law in any other line of work, what gives you extra protection than any other citizen? Why would the police have extra protection than any other citizen? They negotiated in their contracts, you might say, but what is that talking about? I mean, if you go to the state statute, you're going to find, again, some of that language I'm talking about. It makes no sense. I got to give the FOP, oh boy, they were on their job. They went out there and blanket themselves with every protection there is. And that's why, partially why, it's very difficult to prosecute police officers who clearly have used excessive force and have undertaken their job in a dismal way. No knock warrant bans. Yes, that should be statewide. There should be no knock warrant bans. There should be mandatory camera requirements where police interact with the public. It should be there statewide. I don't think there's any question about that, that should be done. And there is another thing. There has to be transparency. There must be transparency, effective and transparent data collection on all use of force encounters and stops and complaints on various officers. This should be kept in a central place and made available appropriately. We should re-examine and put in place policies that promote better community police relations, like community policing, and that adapts the culture and behavior of police to the expectations of the community. We do not work for the police. We don't. The police work for us. They should reflect what we want, not what they want. They can inform and input the process, but they should reflect what we want. And at the end of the day, if someone doesn't feel comfortable with that, they should go into another line of work. People go into different lines of work all the time. But they shouldn't say, I'm going into this line of work and I demand that you do A, B, C, D, and E. No, that's not it. That's not it. And I think the unions have gone overboard. I'm a union guy. I was born and raised in a union family. Proud of it. I stand for unions. I believe workers' rights is important to establish. But what are workers' rights? You're talking about working conditions. You're talking about pay. You're talking about time off. You're talking about all those kinds of things. But they're getting into this whole process of, hey, I don't have to talk to you. And guess what? In the state statute, that mayor, Mayor Fisher, or any other mayor in Kentucky, if someone's investigated, they can't say anything till the investigation is completed. Come on. That's ridiculous. This is the chief executive of the city. The chief executive has to do what the chief executive has to do to protect the citizenry. And one of his obligations is to be transparent with the citizenry. Yet state law is preventing him from being transparent? No. Something's woefully wrong with that. We need to take a look at that. In fact, we need to change that, in my opinion. We're talking about the police here. But let me say, this thing goes a lot broader than the police, a lot broader than the police. Because what you have here is something in terms of institutional and structural racism. It affects us in every aspect of our lives. Let's start with environment. If you look across this country and even in our community, who do you find in the shadows of industry that's spewing toxins into the air and into the environment? You find African Americans, you find brown people, you find poor people. That's who you find in these areas, susceptible to all kinds of health maladies. But the fact of the matter is that that is a lack of government protecting aspects or classes of its citizenry. But you can go further than that. Take healthcare. We already know as a result of COVID-19, well, let me restate that. We already know that there's health disparities in the African American community. This COVID-19 has put it on front page because when you analyze who COVID impacted disproportionately, it's the Black community. Indisputable across the country and even here in Kentucky. We know that. But this whole idea of disparities in healthcare has been there all along. Why is it that we're not proactive on that? Why is it? Well, I filed a bill twice. Which says basically that we do look into these disparities. We do have to look into this and get information to make better policy, because that's what I am. I'm a policymaker. My colleagues are a policymaker. There's 38 in the Senate, 100 in the House, and 138 people at one point in time, have the authority and the responsibility to make policy in the state of Kentucky for the entire state. So if we have that responsibility, should we not also have a responsibility to know all that we can know before we pass certain policies, particularly if they have a disparate impact on the citizenry? Well, guess what? We do that with fiscal bills. If we pass something that requires money, we require what, in most instances, what we call a fiscal note. And that means that it has to be studied carefully, and the findings of that study is revealed to the General Assembly before we vote on that policy. Before. So what's different about the healthcare situation when we know there's disparate impact, and that each time we pass a policy, or let me state it another way, each time we don't pass a policy where we know there's a deficiency, are we serving all our citizenry? I would argue that we aren't. It's not a difficult thing to do. So even as we speak, members of the local health department, members of the state health department, my assigned staff, Senate, we're in discussions of analyzing the situation and determining how should that be framed? What should the responsibility of the health department be in terms of being proactive in this area? What is the responsibility of the legislature in terms of flagging those issues that could come up working against or disproportionately against people of color, African Americans? So we're going to be looking at that, and we're going to see if the legislature is responsive to this obvious deficiency. And if it doesn't, I'm gonna continue that effort, and I'm gonna be very vocal about it, and I'm gonna go from one end of Kentucky to the other, educating about it. But we can pass a bill here and there, but no, we need to systematically begin to look at what is wrong as it relates to how health is distributed and its benefits in the Commonwealth. Well, let's go further. Criminal justice system. I filed another bill 2 times in a row. Now, I got to tell you, they won't even hear this bill. Think about this. we're dealing with issues of race, they won't even hear it, even though we have a history that dates all the way back to slavery. Even though we know that Black states, Southern states, instituted Black codes to purposely put African Americans at a disadvantage and under their control of white people. We know that we came through a whole system of separate but unequal, that we were subject to all kinds of deficiencies. We were afforded no opportunities in some areas and a lack of opportunities in others. We know that even during FDR's day, when they had the New Deal, when Jim Crow was rampant, they still, in government policy, did not extend that to African Americans. They did not extend that to African Americans. That may sound like news to some people, but it's documented, everything that I'm saying. We know this. We know this. We know that when the Great Society under Johnson was put into place, that systematically they undermined the ability of the precepts of the Great Society, even though we made significant gains. What do you think Medicare and Medicaid came out of? Social Security dating back to FDR. But Black folks still, many of those gains were drawn back. When they talked about affirmative action, they compromised. The courts even stepped in. No, it doesn't make any difference that we enslaved you and took your money and took your labor and profited and built a country on your back. Thank you very much. No, there's a debt. There's a debt. That's why you hear people talking about reparations. And to some people, that sounds repugnant, but the fact of the matter, there is a debt due. There's a debt owed. But in this case, and we'll get back to that, filed a bill called the Racial Impact Study Requirement, where when there's an indication that there's a disparate impact in the criminal justice or the application of rules, et cetera, and policies we adopt, may adopt in the criminal justice system. They stopped that from being heard. One of those who was willing to talk with me straight said, I kind of favor this, but they won't let me. They don't like it. Don't like what? They don't like more information on which to make solid determinations, to set policy that impacts real people, real lives. That's unconscionable. Well, we have those protesters out there saying enough's enough. Well, I'm sitting right here saying enough's enough. Enough is enough. Declare yourself. So let me talk about reparations one more time. Look, we know that part of the deficiency that African Americans experience in this country now is because they never were paid for the labor. Not only were they not paid for the labor, laws were put into place to structurally, ultimately, historically, and even now, structurally manifest itself in the lack of opportunity and the inability to accumulate wealth at any significant measure, or pace, or rate. This wasn't because something was wrong with Black folks. Certainly Black folks didn't do that to themselves, did they? No, they didn't do it to themselves. You hear me say all the time, those who listen, that this is not a Black problem. This is a white problem. Let me say that again. This is not a Black problem. This is a white problem. And I'm not talking about the racists, the overt racists, those who feel that Black folks are inherently inferior and deserve no more, that they're tired of hearing this cry of victimization, that if Black folks would just work harder, they would do better, despite their inherently inferior, of course. No. I'm talking about people of goodwill, people that know that that's a lie. people who sat silently who happen to be white. Does that not raise the question of complicity? You may feel one way, but you go along with what wrong is. Are we not our brothers and our sisters' keepers? A country of based on primarily Christian faith, but you go beyond that, the Muslims and any other faith that you can identify in the boundaries of this country, every one of them has a tenet in it that reaches out and cries out for our responsibility to each other. How can you be silent? How can they be silent? They know. They know. I've had white people come to me and ask me, what can I do? I'm gonna follow your lead. Don't follow my lead. Go over and talk to them white people. You know the answer. Bring them on out. Call them on out. Work with us. You don't have to run around behind us. Work with us. We've been putting these issues on the table since time immemorial. There's not a lot of wheels to reinvent. Only thing all of us need is to show a little respect for each other. What we need is for each of us to reach out and make this a better society. We need to work on making this a more perfect union. We can do it if we do it together. And if we start with an acknowledgement of exactly what's going on, not excuses, an acknowledgement, we can get this done. But silence is not acceptable. Yes, we got a hate crimes bill that does absolutely nothing. How could a legislature pass a hate crimes bill and beat their chests like they've done so much when it does nothing? It's not a separate crime. Hate crime is not a separate crime. Or it's not a separate penalty. The penalties we have under the law already exist. The hate crime added nothing, except it gave the parole board the ability to take in consideration something determined to be a hate crime so you don't get parole. Heck, they don't have to give you parole now. They don't have to do that now. It gives the judge the ability not to grant probation. They don't have to grant probation now on a crime. They already have that discretion. The hate crime bill that we have in law does absolutely nothing else. What a joke. What a farce. Enough is enough. So here's where I am. I think that if you join me and my colleagues, white and black, people of goodwill, people who are willing to speak out, people who will not sit down, shut up, and accept what is wrong, but will put the issue squarely on the table, that will say to those who are tone deaf, and that's being kind, that enough's enough. We're not going to do that anymore. Change is in the air. Change must come. And you, my dear friends, must be a part of it. So that's going to end my commentary today. Next week, we're going to show you a little talk with U.S. Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. You see him on TV all the time, fighting the good fight. It was a delightful interview, in fact. I think you'll enjoy it. It'll be at 12 noon. I invite you to join Straight Talk at that time. And I ask you to share. I ask you to share this liberally as far as you can. I also want to encourage you, as I do all the time, you do a video, you do some talking, and you share it. Send it to me, send it to somebody else. Let's start this conversation. And let's not let this moment that very well may turn into a movement, get past us. Let's get it done right this time. So God bless you, and I'll see you again next Saturday, right here 12 noon with Straight Talk. Do the right thing.